Welcome to another edition of Underground Strategy. Today we're joined by Lieutenant Colonel and Dr. Jean-Pierre Scherman, a military historian and accomplished officer who served during the 1998 campaign in Lesotho. We'll be speaking about Operation Boleas, that's what it was called, the challenges on the ground, and why it's time to revisit the way this intervention has been understood. Welcome, JP, and before we dive into the operation, could you give us some background on what happened in Lesotho in 1998 and how Operation Boleas was meant to restore order?
Hello, Tony and Max. Thank you once again for inviting me to come and speak at Underground Strategy. It's always a pleasure for me to be able to talk to you and your listeners. Operation Boleas has occupied quite a niche within South African military history for various reasons. It's quite a historically significant event within our own defense forces history and within our country's general history. Boleas was a first for many, many reasons. And the South African National Defence Force had only been established out of 7 different parties that were in conflict literally the day before in 1994. So this is the first time that a newly constituted South African National Defence Force is given a task to go operational outside the borders of South Africa. And all the legalities attached to that type of mission, the leaving the borders, operating in a different country, that alone would make it significant. If you add to the fact that it's the South African National Defence Force newly constituted, add to the fact that it's the first time that an South African commander of the National Defence Force, General Siphiwe Nyanda, is in command of the operation, gives it a double historical significance. So there are really many, many reasons why this has fascinated South Africans and military historians in general across the globe for many, many years. Added to this is that this operation mission, as you want to classify it, has got 2 sides to it, like any story has. And there is a military side that obviously the military historians amongst us enjoy, but there's also a political side. And people have got their opinions about it, specifically about the results. And many people haven't been able to differentiate between the political side of the story and the military side. The political objectives that they wanted to obtain and achieve, and the military objectives they wanted to be obtained and achieved. And commentary on this thing often confuses the two together, and you'll find that commentators are generally quite negative about the South Africa's involvement in it, specifically when South Africa today. Boleas is considered a bit of a blight on the SANDF's reputation, which I personally think is an unfair observation, and I'll explain to the listeners why as we go through that the SANDF, for all its faults, and please, no organization is perfect, but for all its faults, it did what it was asked to do, and quite strenuous circumstances. The political side, I'll let the readers and listeners determine for themselves how good or how bad that was. But if you can understand that these are 2 sides as a starting off point, then the story will make a lot more sense to you as we go forward.
It is very nice to meet you, JP. And as we all know, I wasn't a part of the last episode you did with Tony, but I did edit that one on North Africa, and I really enjoyed that. And this was actually one of the first African military operations I remember hearing about when I was younger. I still recall there being quite a lot of talk around it, especially from the European Union, which back then was still kind of finding its feet. And I think they described it as something like an appropriate assumption of regional responsibility. A lot of those fancy words. So in theory, they supported it, but there was definitely a lot of noise around it too. Just to get the timeline straight, mainly for myself and also for listeners that might be less familiar, when you say the South African National Defence Force was newly formed at the time, are we talking around 1994 there? So it would have been about 4 or 5 years old when this happened?
Yes, Max, that's exactly what we're talking about. 27th of April, 1994, 7 different organizations amalgamate to form the South African National Defence Force. Now, these were all enemies at one stage. These were people that were literally trying to kill one another the day before. And as far as my knowledge knows, South Africa is the only country on this planet that's ever successfully integrated fully combatants into a new national defense force. Many countries have tried, and it's just turned into a bloodbath or a total mess of some sort or another. So again, for all South Africa's fault, the South African National Defence Force is a testimony to South Africa's willingness to be able to forgive, willingness to move forward, willingness to try and make our country a better place than what it was beforehand. And the South African National Defence Force has played a pivotal role in maintaining the stability within South Africa over the last 30 years, since 1994. And this was literally one of the first demonstrable steps that the South African National Defence Force took in this nation-building process was Operation Boleas. It was an organization of strangers who had been forced very quickly to forget about where they came from, what they were doing, and forge a national organizational spirit. And only conflict can do that. You can speak about it in the classroom as much as what you want, but until you're actually faced with an enemy and you're lying in the same trench with the bullets flying over your head with the person next to you and you realize your life depends on that person, you don't care what his political affiliation or his religious affiliation or his language is. You're both wearing the same uniform. And Boleas was that trigger to be able to get the South African National Defence Force over that initial hurdle, which our general society hasn't had. That's why our general society still has lingering issues with integration. The South African National Defence Force, I think, is far more advanced than our general South African society, simply because we were forced to go through things like Boleas, which strips away all the fluff of society and just brings it down to the bare bones. This is a person, you're a person, your life depends on him, his life depends upon you. How are you going to go about getting your mission out and getting your men and sorting out what you have to do as a soldier?
That is indeed a powerful way to put it. And honestly, I don't think a lot of people, especially those of us further up north, fully grasp just how unique that is. I mean, you hear integration as a word and you think policy, negotiation, some political process, etc. But what you're describing is men who were trying to kill each other one day and then crawling into the trenches together the next. That's something else entirely, in my opinion. And I imagine that must have shaped everything that followed, including how this operation actually came together on the ground. So if we take a step back to that moment before you rolled out, what were your expectations like at the time? I mean, in terms of the intelligence picture, the kind of resistance you thought you would face, or even how much you were told going in?
That's a very good question, because one of the critical areas that commentators have liked to go after the outcome of the mission was around intelligence. Now, no intelligence officer going to always give you exactly what you want to know. But intelligence was a bit of an issue with Boleas. Now, there are various reasons for this. As an active participant in the operation itself, I sat in on the order groups. And I remember clearly what was told to me as a junior officer. I was a lieutenant. I was 24 years old. I was the second in command of an armored car squadron. And our squadron had been tasked to lead the advance of a combat group of about 600 soldiers into Maseru. And I sat in those initial briefings. I did not at that stage understand that all the political machine guns going and shenanigans going on behind the scenes. I just understood the military side. And our initial intelligence was quite shallow. It was not in detail. And I have, over the years now, as an academic, interviewed a lot of the intelligence officers who were involved. And it basically comes down to a brand new headquarters, a brand new sub-headquarters, and to a large extent, a very small window, a time frame of about a week to be able to cobble together a military operation. So the intelligence is shallow. We get a basic rundown of the Lesotho Defence Force, their major bases in Maseru, the possible opposition that we can face. But you must remember that it might be 4 years later, it is SANDF now, but many of the leading figures, I'm talking about company commander, battalion commander, brigade commander, are all still old SADF. These are European officers with a long history of conflict on South Africa's borders. And I think there we had a bit of a challenge because they had a frame of reference as the conflict fighting the Cubans in Angola, fighting SWAPO in Angola, and they were very dismissive of the Lesotho Defence Force. Small country, not particularly highly regarded. And I think that is where a lot of our challenges lie, is that we didn't take into consideration that these people are still on home soil. They are defending their home, defending their nation from who they perceive to be an outside aggressor. And our politicians didn't understand this either, because they put a very firm cap on how many soldiers could deploy. Now, think for yourself, Maseru is the capital city of an independent nation. If you want to seize control of an entire capital city, you do not send 600 soldiers to do their job. 600 soldiers can't control a football stadium during a football match, never mind in a capital city. So it is a bit of arrogance, it's a bit of underestimating, it's a bit of legacy that We've dealt with these people over many years. We've been friends for many years. There's no reason for them to be aggressive against us. So it's a mixture of all these various strands that leads to a volatile and unpredictable situation that the South Africans eventually find themselves in that first couple of hours while in Maseru.
JP, thank you. Just for our listeners, a bit of context. At that point, the president is Nelson Mandela. You had mentioned the president. So we have Nelson Mandela being the president. And to your point about, this kind of difference of opinion between the older fighters, with the Bush war tradition. And I just want you to build a little bit, just a line or two, that the terrain in Lesotho is not easy terrain.
Absolutely. Obviously, Maseru built up cities, skyscrapers, all the rest of it. So from a man-made urban perspective, it's a capital city in every way that you would imagine a capital city to look, with parliamentary buildings and hospitals and schools and a central business district, brick, mortar, double, triple, 5-story high-rises. Then you have the physical topography, which is on the foot of the Drakensberg Mountains. Now, for those who don't know South Africa's geography, this is the highest mountain range within our country. Lesotho also boasts the highest point in southern Africa. Drakensberg is over 2,000 meters high, has snow. All the ski resorts of southern Africa are located within this area, so you can understand the topography that we're dealing with. The city itself is built on a very narrow river plain. The Caledon River goes through the area. On the little piece of flat alluvial plain, the city is built, but the background is all these massive snow-capped mountains in the distance that you can see. And obviously, the mountains channel forces, they restrict your movement. And the Caledon River itself, to get over the river, there's only X amount of bridges. So if you want to enter into Maseru, you literally have only 1 or 2 exits and entry point into the city itself. So from a defensive position, not that difficult to determine where aggressor would be coming if they wanted to cross into Maseru.
Time for a tactical reload. If you're enjoying this, leave a review on your platform. YouTube crew, hit subscribe to support the mission. Let's roll.
For sure. And I think historically we know that, I'm talking about 300 years ago, 200, we know from the Lesotho wars with Mashresh, where they always had a strong, the mountainous kingdom for a reason. So we know that. And now, just building on what you said the situation on the ground, there were these complex issues, but then we also came to know there was a bit of mission creep in it. And then how did the South African forces adapt to that?
Well, to understand the mission creep, you have to understand a little bit about the two triggers. Now, the political side is all about, there's a contested election, and the elections take place a year earlier in June of 1997. And after the elections take place, the leader of the dominant party, Dr. Ntu Mogelele, he's the leader of the Basotho Congress Party. But after the elections, he suddenly gets up in parliament and he says, well, he's resigning from this party, and he started a brand new party. And he calls this new party the Lesotho Congress for Democracy. And he takes within 41 members of the cabinet over to the new party. So by default, a brand new political party is the dominant party within Lesotho politics. Nobody's voted for them. Nobody has even heard about them. And for the other members that have not moved over, they were the government that morning, and by that afternoon, they're suddenly now the opposition, because they are no longer part of this new party that's just been formed. And there's a lot of questions about the legality of it and what to do next. And that is the political trigger for what is going on. Lesotho has historically never had a good relationship between their politicians and their soldiers. Their military is very politicized. And you will see that a lot of the soldiers actively participate in politics and support the politicians of their choice. And this is also what's happening. A lot of the Lesotho Defence Force members are aligned with the old Basotho Congress Party. And when they hear that the LCD is now a new party numbers never heard of, has suddenly taken over command, they're like, no, this is not the way this story is supposed to play out. They start siding with the opposition. And this all leads King Letsie III to basically annul his entire parliament and say, we are going to have a rerun. We have to re-vote again. And this time there will be on the ballot now a BCP. If you want to vote for BCP, fine. There will be a new LCD rather. If you want to still vote for the old BCP, but the citizens of Lesotho can decide. And this vote takes place in May of 1998. And when the results are released, it is an absolute shocker. Of the 79 seats that are available, the brand new LCD has taken 78. So literally, there's only one seat available for the opposition. Now, Lesotho follows very similar to the UK, a first-past-the-post system. In other words, the first party that gets within a certain ward, 50.1% is the winner. So if another party got 49%, it gets nothing. It's only the 51%ers who get the vote. So when it comes down, almost 30% of the entire, or more than 35% of the entire population vote for opposition, but they have no say in government because of this first-past-the-post system. So that is already an issue, and that's a political issue. If you add on the military side, these youngsters within the Lesotho Royal Defence Force, they look at the situation and feel, well, this can't be the way it should be. The senior leadership of the Lesotho Defence Force is more pragmatic. They're aligned with the government of the day. And when the youngsters hear this, they decide that they are going to basically arrest their officer commanding, the general officer commanding of the Royal Lesotho Defence Force, Lieutenant General Mosakeng. He gets arrested along with 20 of his senior officers by basically juniors, and the juniors now openly side with the opposition. And this is the military side of it. So you have these two challenges. You have a political contested elections. Now you have semi-military coup, a coup taking place within the Royal Lesotho Defence Force itself, where the top leadership of the organization has been cut off and arrested and jailed. And now the army has been run by captains and lieutenants. Everybody above them either in jail or in hiding. A lot of them flee to South Africa as a result. So you have these two competing missions now that SADC, which is the Southern African Development Community, which governs the countries in Southern Africa, they're now sitting with this problem, what to do next. How do we solve this political question and a military question at the same time?
I think that's a really solid breakdown of the political backdrop. It's a mess, but a very structured mess in hindsight. But I'm curious, how did all that actually spill over into the military mission on the ground? Because when you hear about this kind of thing, it often starts with one objective, and then suddenly you're guarding palaces, securing infrastructure, protecting diplomats, and half of the tasks weren't even a part of the plan to begin with. So what did that shift look like for you on the ground? Was it clear early on that this was going to balloon beyond what was originally briefed?
From the military side, the military's major objective was restore calm to Maseru. Because like any military mission, the nation's peacekeeping mission, the military can't hold elections. They can't change politics. What they can do is they can create a stable situation where politicians can then work and do what politicians do for a living. So that was the African National Defence Force, and SADC, for that matters, military side, restore this balance. But to do that, you had to firstly remove the youngsters from command, get their senior leadership of the Lesotho National Defence back in office and get them back under control and giving orders, and then take control over these military bases. That is what it starts off as. But the minute that the South Africans get into Lesotho, this mission creep starts taking place, because now the political side starts to play a part. The king, let's say the third palace, must now be protected. So you have to send soldiers there. South Africa gave millions and millions of rands to construct a major water project within Lesotho. That's a Katsi River project, and it provides water to a large section of industrialized South Africa. Now, South African taxpayers almost completely funded that entire project, and we're talking about billions and billions of rands. So that is obviously high priority, not only for its monetary value, but the fact that it gives water to the most industrialized section of South Africa. So there's a section of the military that has to deploy. Now, this is not in the city. This is in the stick. This is in the rural, high up in the mountains. That's a double curvature dam built high up in the Drakensberg Mountains that holds an enormous amount of water. But obviously, its protection is paramount to not only the SANDF, but to South Africa as well, being itself. So you get all these mission creep. You have all these embassies and volunteer staff that are within the city. It's a capital city, so it's got embassies, it's got diplomatic staff. So the protection of all these embassies and staff suddenly becomes South African responsibility overnight. And this is also the first time that South Africa is doing a peacekeeping mission. I don't think we understood in many ways the mission creep part of it, how many extra tasks we would be given based on a 600-man limited manpower structure. It became quite intense quite quickly.
Wow, that escalated fast. You got palace security, a dam in the mountains, embassies, and all that's on top of the original objective. And I imagine that's all landing on the same 600 troops, right? So I have to ask, how did that affect command and control? I mean, this wasn't just a complex mission. It sounds like it became a patchwork of responsibilities just overnight. What did it look like on the ground, and how did you actually manage to coordinate?
Well, it's quite a complex situation in the sense that, again, this is the first time. So higher up, I already told you that General Spiro Yande is the first African head of the South African National Defence Force. Now, a year earlier, we had reshuffled our total organization, we as the SANDF, and we now have 2 brigade headquarters. Now, these brigade headquarters are just headquarters in name. They don't have normal assigned forces underneath them. So one of them is 4-3 Brigade and the other one is 4-6. And one of these brigade headquarters is then activated and sent down to Ladybrand, which is directly opposite Maseru. And then forces are then attached to this headquarters. Now, these forces are fortunate in that they have worked together before, because we normally have military exercise within the South African National Defence Force that takes place in November, December, at the end of our training year at our training centre in the Northern Cape. It's very similar to the Americans' National Training Centre. It's a large piece of area in the middle of nowhere that we can do brigade-size exercise. So these forces have, on a conventional training exercise, worked together before. And they form part of what was, the old terminology was a rapid deployment force of the old SADF. Now, these forces are all activated, and they're activated from the closest military base to Maseru is Bloemfontein. And Bloemfontein, by default, also is the core of South Africa's mechanized forces. So the tank regiments, armor car regiments, paratroopers, mechanized infantry are all based within Bloemfontein. So those forces are all then activated and given to this newly formed headquarters to operate. But they're operating within the Free State. And the Free State, as a province, also has its own military headquarters, Free State Command. So you have a multi-layered headquarters above you. If you're a soldier on the ground, you have your battalion headquarters, you have Task Force Boleas headquarters, you have the brigade headquarters, you have Orange Free State Command headquarters, and then you have National Defence Force headquarters. And many of the intelligence issues also runs through, because you have all these different layers, that intelligence is flying up and down, that sometimes it gets lost in translation as it jumps from headquarters to headquarters. The time zone also, the amount of time it takes for intelligence to go between them also was an issue because of all these different headquarters, because nobody really foreseen that this would actually be a story to sort out only 4 years after the SANDF had been established.
No, I think that's actually really impressive, especially considering how new the force was at the time. This kind of layered command structure, intelligence bouncing between HQs, overlapping responsibilities, that's something even well-established armies will struggle with today. And doing all that while shifting from garrison to full deployment under a week, that's a huge ask. It kind of puts things in perspective, because it's easy to pick apart operations like this in hindsight. But when you actually look at the setup, the time pressure, and the gaps you're working with, it's remarkable it held together at all.
A forward headquarters versus a rear headquarters. Now, this is because the 4-6 Brigade is now a forward deployed tactical headquarters, where Free State Command is a static headquarters in the city of Bloemfontein, while Defence Headquarters is installed in Pretoria. And these lines of communication, these lines of logistics, these lines of command, how are they running? And I don't know if I mentioned, but there's a meeting, SADC's ministers in Mauritius, to discuss once in a while, all the SADC prime ministers or presidents come together for a meeting, and this happens to take place over this time in Mauritius. And Tony said, yes, President Mandela is our president at that stage, but during Boleas, he is not in the country. Neither is his second in command, who's the Deputy President Thabo Mbeki, or the third in command, who's the Foreign Minister, Alfred Nzo. All three, number 1, number 2, and number 3, are external. And the acting president is the minister, a guy called Mangosuthu Buthelezi. And he's just a normal minister in the cabinet. But this lands on his lap as the acting president. And he has to make that final call. President Mandela gives him the authority to make that final call. And it's actually the acting president, Buthelezi, who actually gives the go-ahead for the SANDF to deploy. But from that go-ahead, when the SANDF crosses over into Maseru, is less than 7 days. And anybody who's ever done any military mission, to go from a peacetime in garrison in your normal home unit doing your garrison duty, do that mental mind shift from peace to doing a military mission within 7 days is quite a lot to ask of soldiers. And I think that partially plays a big role in what eventually happens within Maseru.
So it really does sound like a hectic situation, politically, logistically, and I assume even mentally, of course. But from the outside, especially for those of us who weren't there, what people remember most clearly is what they saw on TV, right? A lot of buildings burning, mass looting, chaos in the streets. Can we talk a bit about that side of it? What it actually looked like on the ground in those first 24 hours before we move into the broader aftermath?
Absolutely. Tony knows, and I'm assuming you know, but I don't know if you know. I'm an armor officer. The armor, we work in a very small grouping. A normal armored car, main battle tank only has a crew of 4. So when we deploy into Maseru, we are not deploying with anything about riot control or anti-looting operations or protecting of buildings and embassies. We're an armor squad, and we are looking for other armor to shoot out with high explosive or anti-tank rounds. And after the first 24 hours, this rioting, this looting takes precedence. It's on the news, it is across the TV channels across the world, and the South Africans feel that they must try and stop the looting. And I remember my squadron being ordered to try and go into the central business district of Maseru, stop our armored cars, and climb out. That means at the most 3 people can climb out because the driver must always remain with the vehicle for obvious reasons. So 3 guys climb out. Now, if there are 1,000 people ransacking a supermarket and you're climbing out with 12 or 13 or 15 people, there is literally no ways that you can make any difference to 1,000 people looting a shop. So you can try your best, and when I try my best, you're going to use force, because just to speak to people is pointless. They're not interested in listening to your story, but please stop stealing these people's goods and stuff. You literally have to take them by the scruff of the neck and drag them out of these stores and try and protect these stores. And that is, again, if you give that task to 20 or 30 or 40 or even 200-300 people for a capital city, you're going to make absolutely no dent in the looting whatsoever. The looters will just bypass you. They just go around your small grouping and loot the shop on the other side of the block, around the corner. And that is what everybody sees on TV. The SANDF standing there trying with 15 guys to stop 1,000 looters and just being overwhelmed. And everybody says, but why are there only 15 guys there? What the hell are you guys thinking? Why are you not deploying? You have a defense force of 75,000 men. Why are there only 15? Nobody knows that. It wasn't the SANDF's choice to send only 600 people into Maseru. That was political choice. The 15 that are deployed, they're doing the best that they can with what they have.
No, it was difficult, JP, and I feel, I only joined afterwards. We've discussed before the Defense Force, SANDF, and it got a bad rap because of it. It got a bit of a, what the younger people call a bum rap, these days. It's unfortunate. And I think what I like is that a lot of your work is revising this. It's a bit of a revisionist history, besides your actual service in the campaign. Your scholarship now is going back and looking at these things. And we discussed mission creep, but you guys were given this kind of crowd control task, but there was also full-on conventional operations, full-on mechanized, paratroopers fighting, armor involved. But at one point, you are sent in with ammunition that's not adequate, if I can put it diplomatically. You have to go back, bomb up again, as we would say, or you have to, get armed again to the teeth and then move into the deployment.
Yes, absolutely. The initial orders were for the 2 major military bases within Maseru, the Ratsamotsi base and Makonyane base. Those 2 bases were identified as obviously the main objectives from a military perspective. We had to seize control over those 2 bases as quickly as possible. And the paratroopers from 1 parachute battalion were given the 1 base, and the armor car squadron from 1 special service battalion was given what on paper seemed the more complex of the 2 bases. It was the Royal Lesotho Defence Forces headquarters, and it was if any resistance was to take place. The military intelligence thought that it would take place at Ratsamotsi because it's the headquarters. It's where these renegade young officers had set up their shop, and that's what they expected. So they sent in the armor car squadron as the lead-in squadron. But that being said, there was always this back idea that nothing's going to happen. They will be so intimidated by the mighty South African National Defence Force coming in that who would be dumb enough, who would even dare to confront this force? And you can understand the bit of almost arrogance, I suppose, from the South Africans' point of view, that why would this little country even bother to resist us? They know they can't win. And that shows in the amount of ammunition that you correctly said, how much ammunition that the squadron is given. The squadron is given not even first line ammunition, a handful of rounds as an afterthought. It's not given a full complement, because why would you want full complement of ammunition? That's way too aggressive. That means you're expecting something to happen and you're expecting combat. And that's not what the South Africans were expecting. They were given pamphlets to hand out. A nice little printed pamphlet saying, we come in peace. This is the type of mindset that many of the South Africans enter into Maseru with. They're not entering, unlike what the newspapers say, invasion of Lesotho. This was hardly from the mental perspective of the South Africans an invasion. This was going to Maseru, park your vehicles inside these bases, find the commander, tell him, listen, Lieutenant, you're no longer in charge. Please pack up your bags and go home. We'll call you when we're ready to talk to you again. That's a type of mentality. And when you get in, as next minute, everybody's shooting at you and there's absolute chaos, to be able to make that mind shift from, okay, this is not exactly what I was expecting. We're now full-blooded combat here. That takes literally a couple of seconds for your brain to make all those adjustments.
And when it came to combat, like you said, when those adjustments were made, the first shot against the chin and the legs, but then when the guys got ready for it, they did a good job. They pushed forward, and you've documented some of this yourself, not only through your own experience, as you were mentioning dispatches, but also the other forces and colleagues, in full-on attacks, and I think using even high explosive rounds in some places, the paratroopers and fighting through the objectives.
Absolutely. Again, like I mentioned earlier, we were fortunate in that this yearly exercise takes place. So many of these forces that were taking place had worked together on numerous occasions at the South African Combat Training Center. So they were conventionally well trained. We were not really trained for peace support operations. Our focus was very much on conventional. So on the conventional side, the South Africans did exceedingly well. Within a couple of hours, 24 hours at the most, the military objective had been obtained. The two bases were under our control. Yes, we'd taken a bit of casualties, but that is the nature of warfare. When people shoot at one another, somebody is bound to get hurt. But the political side is where we had a struggle. Once the shooting stopped, the more peacekeeping side, keeping groups apart, the looting, that's where the mission took a major criticism. The fighting, the first 24 hours, yes, fighting was unexpected. And yes, the casualties that the South Africans experienced was unexpected. Because they're unexpected, but to be realistic, we as soldiers assume that the casualties will take place when you go into situations like that. That the fact that our politicians were kind of shocked that we're taking casualties is a bit naive. I think if you send soldiers into a combat situation, you must expect obviously not only the good, but the negative sides of that decision making as well.
Certainly. And the media made a meal of it, right? I think there was a lot of critique out there. Do you think any of this criticism is fair? And, as I mentioned earlier, you're doing a lot of revisionist work yourself on that. And I think our listeners will be interested in that. And I think if I can just plug your upcoming book, because I think that is certainly a revisionist history of the campaign. I think that's due. Would you agree? And can you maybe just comment on the media a little bit, JP?
I don't think that the criticism is fair, in the sense that you must measure any military mission against the parameters of what is the task that they were sent to do and can they achieve it. Now, I already said, within 24 hours, the South African National Defence Force achieved its set missions. Stabilize Lesotho, take over the military bases, take over Katsi Dam, protect the King's Palace. Those missions were achieved within 24 hours. The follow-on missions and all the mission creep that happens afterwards that are not generally part and parcel of a military mission, the fact that there was a bit of a breakdown is hardly the South African National Defence Force's fault, in my opinion. So, was it perfectly planned? Obviously not. Did everything go according to plan? No mission ever does. But if you look at it from a holistic perspective, I differ quite drastically because newspapers obviously are there to sell newspapers. That's what they do. So, it reads much better disaster in Lesotho versus well done, good job in Lesotho. Disaster will always sell more newspapers than well done will. So, I take the reporting with a pinch of salt, to be perfectly honest. Many times, and even later in my career, when we started deploying in the DRC and in the Sudan, one thing like I mentioned about the South African National Defence Force is we don't do PR. We do not do that at all. We care what they say, but we don't really take it to heart in many ways. Our independent media, one of our strong suits of our democracy is that our media has free right to bash and trash any state organ that they please. And we have made ourselves guilty of not really portraying what we do well and trying to hide what we do badly, which has backfired on us. So whenever you, as Africans, talk about the military, if you are closely connected with somebody that's serving in uniform, the general perception around the South African Defence Force, even today, is rather negative, because the only thing that you will ever hear in the newspapers or see on the TV is when we've done something wrong. But if you do something right, it's quiet as a church mouse.
Yeah, definitely. But this sounds like a classic mismatch in expectations, especially from the outside. And like you said, I don't think most media outlets, or the public for that matter, really understood what the actual objectives were. They just saw fire, chaos, and ran with that. But if you step back and look at it politically, I mean, at the time, countries like the United States, the UK, and even the European Union, they were broadly supportive. Maybe not clapping their hands in the streets, but they seemed to see it as a step towards regional stability. Maybe calling it restoring democracy is a bit of a stretch, but stabilizing the government, securing infrastructure, calming the military situation, I think they understood those goals. Whether the public back home did, that's another story.
Again, that's one of the few things that we again didn't take into consideration. That strategic corporal, that young corporal standing on the street corner who's now been told to do anti-looting operations. And somebody from Sky News, CNN, suddenly walks up to him and he says, "Soldier, what are you doing here?" He has to respond. He can't just stand there with a mouthful of teeth. And that's not only the corporal, the entire SANDF wasn't really trained or geared towards dealing with the media. We didn't have communication officers and people that had actually thought about this operation had taken place too quickly. So we ourselves, many options, weren't really sure what do we say to these reporters? What can we say? What can't we say? Because under the old South African Defence Force, speaking to the media was a no-no. Everything was top secret. You didn't mention a word to the media. But now they're there in your face. They're right there accompanying you on the battlefield. Everybody's got a camera. Everybody's got a cell phone. And you can't hide away anymore. So you have to have that level of training to deal with the media. And it doesn't just help that it's the brigade commander and his staff who are doing the media briefings. Everybody down to the low corporal on the sidewalk, he must know at least this is what I must say. This is what I can say. This is how I deflect questions that I don't want to answer. Things like that. We never even got close to those type of training before this operation takes place to deal with the media, to deal with the aftermath when things don't go exactly as you hope they would and as you had planned for.
You tuned in, you're liking the vibe, so why not buy us a beer? Think of it as hydration for strategy. Head to undergroundstrategy.com/support and keep us in the fight. All right, back to business. So, with all of that in mind, from the mission scope to the media side to how fast it all came together, if you look back at it now, what do you think were the biggest takeaways from Operation Boleas? Not maybe just for you personally, but maybe for the SANDF as a whole. Because it sounds like there was a lot of lessons packed into a very, very short and intense operation here.
Firstly, that if you are willing to send your soldiers into a potential area where potentially somebody can get hurt, you must have clear mission orders. And I'm talking about political mission orders, a clear mandate and a clear thing. This is what I want you guys to achieve. Then, once you've done that, you must provide enough resources to realistically achieve that objective. Now, South Africa has got historically this ratio always on the low side. We send troops to do a mission and we're always under budget. We try and do the job with the least amount of possible force available. And it just doesn't work. It actually is a lot more dangerous that way for the people involved. Yes, you might be saving an extra couple of rand at the end of the day, but you're also risking losing a lot more than just money on this. So in that sense, that's one of the things that will bug a lot of the members of the South African National Defence is the resources that were committed to this. Then the time span. Every soldier who has ever served in uniform will know that military goes through a cycle. You have a cycle of training, you have a cycle of deployment, you have a cycle of rest. And if you want to go from a cycle of rest to a cycle of deployment, you can't give a week. If you want the job done well and done fairly, you must give a time for. There was no such time for typical things. We like to call them marrying up drills, where different groupings get together, they practice a little bit, they sort that out. Just there was no time for such things like that. So you are deploying literally from cold to hot within 7 days. And that is, I think, an unfair request from anybody, particularly soldiers, to go into those type of situations. And then at the beginning of our introduction to United Nations peacekeeping operations, we had done it, individual tasks that are involved, but we had not collectively thought about United Nations and how peacekeeping will work and how peace enforcement will work. But this will break the ice. Boleas will be a very rude introduction to peacekeeping. And once South Africa gets over the shock of peacekeeping out of Boleas, the next year, when the United Nations, the old monarch from the DRC, asks for, will South Africa be prepared to deploy forces to monarch? We're like, okay. Initially, our plan was to wait another 5 years before even considering it. But because of Boleas, and we've already gone through a peacekeeping type of scenario and have come out beaten but alive, we will agree. So we already started sending then forces to the DRC in 1999 for the Monarch operation. And I don't think that would have occurred if it hadn't been for a Boleas type of scenario where we'd gone through all the teething pains in a short period of time, painful lessons learned, but lessons learned well, I actually think.
That's a good set of lessons learned, JP. And I couldn't help but just think when you mentioned a few things like the strategic corporal, and General Krulak, the Marine general who had coined that term. It's so important, right? And you guys really did fight or have the 3-block war that he mentioned. You had the political side that goodness knows what was happening. You had this kind of crowd control meets peacekeeping of some kind and the conventional element. So you really had all these things happening at the same time. It's a case study in itself. Just as you were talking through that, because as I mentioned, when you guys did this, I mean, of course, I was at high school, finishing high school during this. And then when I joined the army and I was at the academy, where you teach now, one of my assignments in the second year was just all sort of pinged into my memory, and the mild panic of a late night before, finishing that essay was on this campaign, actually. And I remember, because when you said that we had met militarily, the objectives were met, I remember, the paratroopers, whatever, some of the recce's had taken the Katsi Dam. And, I struggled to find factually how to substantiate a lot that was portrayed in the media. I suppose Max is also big on this campaign and many others, because it's kind of this thing where everyone says, even people I speak to randomly, they would say, it was just crap, and when you ask them why, planning disaster, this happened, casualties, and you're like, okay, but that could have been any operation in the history of mankind that is some planning issue. You hit a casualty, you hit a landmine, someone gets hurt. Okay, but tell me why. And, people struggle. So it's like a big PR thing. And you had mentioned a lot in some of the previous work, how some of the old guard, if I may say it here, had kind of, they weren't too happy about the new boys on the block, and the new folks coming in. And they kind of had their views, right?
I've obviously interviewed via my academia hat that I wear many of the participants of it, and a lot of the middle management of the operation. I had the sinking suspicion that our higher headquarters would not have particularly cared if Boleas was a bit of a disaster. Specifically, members of the older SANDF could then point and say, look, see, the SANDF, no good, can't do anything proper. This would have been easy for the SANDF to have accomplished. And when the SANDF goes and proves them wrong by achieving all the objectives they set out to do with minimal loss of life, minimal loss of equipment, it came a bit of a shock to them. And they didn't particularly enjoy that experience. And it left a bit of a lingering bitterness in their mouth that the new South African National Defence Force wasn't as bad as what they'd hoped it would be. And for those of us who participated, there's always been a bit of an irritation factor when you get to gatherings and people would ask you, you were part of that disaster. And like you rightly just mentioned, it's okay, explain to me, why is it a disaster? Yes, this. I said, you guys in Angola who are like even worse off, you guys did this or that. So there is a bit of a old guard versus a new guard dynamic to it as well. Those of us who have served in both organizations, I was proud to be a member of the SADF, but I'm prouder to be a member of the SANDF with the challenges that we face today. Those of us who know South Africa and the challenges we face as a country, our state departments, I still believe the National Defence Force, the Department of Defence, is one of, if not the best, state department within our country. We have fulfilled every possible mission that we've ever been asked to perform over the last 30 years, and some of them have ranged from completely wild and wonderful things like fixing water problems and sewerage problems on the Vaal Dam and the Vaal River, to protection of log convoys of international trucking coming in that were attacked by criminal elements, to you name it. The South African Defence Force has done, we're like a jack of all trades, we're like literally a Swiss Army knife for our government. And there's not many militaries that have had the opportunity or have ever been asked to perform such a total vast myriad of operations. And not one of these missions are ever funded. It all comes out of our internal budget. We get given this task, but we never get given extra funds to actually perform it. So we're always scraping from our operational funds, our training funds, our research and development funds, our equipment purchasing funds, all these extra missions that are just randomly thrown in our direction from time to time. And to the members of the South African National Defence Force, to their credit, we never say no. We never say we can't do it. We never say, please ask somebody else. And that includes going to Mozambique and helping with flooding and going to thousands of different COVID. The South African National Defence Force deployed en masse. Every single member of that South African Defence Force was on COVID duty, out on the streets, keeping people safe as best we could, helping in clinics, helping with crowd control, helping with every possible thing that you can think of. And strange enough, after all this, if you still ask the general South African on street, what do you know about the South African National Defence Force? They were like, either I don't know anything, or they'll have something negative to say about it. Yes, there's a bunch of this or that. They don't do this. Their discipline is bad. They look poor. Their uniforms aren't fitting, whatever. So that's why I enjoy being able to speak and have this opportunity like Underground Strategy, to be able to give the other side of the coin, to be able to explain a little bit better from our perspective. We are still citizens of this country, and we do not do this task because we want praise from our citizens. No soldier cares about things like that. But it would, I think, be good to be able to be proud of your South African National Defence Force and what they have achieved over the years, because they are representing you. And if you don't like what we do, then get involved in the South African Defence Force. Send your children to the military and then solve the problem from the inside, instead of standing on the outside and just negatively commenting on the organization. Do your part.
That certainly is fair. And I think when you mentioned that, I remember Evert Jordaan's paper or some of his research, and he kind of the security policy stuff, and he lists, as you mentioned, for the last 30 years, all the missions. And I remember, because our unit was a combat engineer, so you kind of get attached to, this or that and whatever.
We have had water purification on the Vaal River and building bridges that have washed away in the floods in Natal, and you just name it, it's there.
Yeah, it was really immense. At one point it was DRC, Sudan, core support, the borders. So, a regiment of 800 people, forget it. You're just constantly doing something or other. But you're right, the SANDF doesn't brag well, and it doesn't praise itself well, and the PR can be better, because I think, despite all the good things, that's happened, this is not for now, but what's happened in January, February this year in Congo, it's going to be a little bit like the first podcast about North Africa, it's going to be debated for years. And, one can only have, the deepest sympathy for the people that were on the ground doing the best they could there, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. Maybe in a couple of months' time, you and I can speak again, and we can speak about the DRC a little bit on Underground Strategy. Once currently, because this is current news, it's not even historical news, it's happening at the moment. Once that is done and dusted, and we can do an objective and a neutral analysis of the entire DRC from the SNS perspective, maybe you and I can have a chat on the DRC then one day. The South African Brigade was there in the south. General Lawrence Smith was over the time period, one of the sector commanders in the south.
They were very active back then. And then also General Sereko was doing the training shortly after that when he was with Tusai. And they did some good fighting and good peacekeeping after the fighting too. And that's a little plug for General Sereko too. I'm going to circle back to this now. Is there anything that sticks out in your mind? Like we leave the scholarship aside, but from your personal experience there for Operation Boleas.
I don't know if the readers know, but I was unfortunately hurt. So I spent a little bit of time in hospital. And one of my enduring memories was when I was discharged out of hospital, I literally went back to my home regiment and was told that I could return to Boleas within 24 hours if I chose. And I said, okay, I will go back. And how surreal it was for me crossing over for a second time over the Caledon River, this time traveling in a little Land Rover, where the last time I traveled had been in an armored car armed to the teeth. I cross over in a little Land Rover and I enter into the city, and to see, it was literally about 6 weeks later, the damage that had been done with the fires and the looting. But what was for me the most obvious was that people's lives had gone on. Everybody was on street. Everybody was just as if nothing had changed. That whole, okay, so we've like spent all this time, all this effort, all this loss of life. And how is Lesotho better or worse off because of this action now? And as I drove through the city now, drove up to the base, seeing people and children playing football in the streets. And the last time I'd gone through there, it had been a bit of a wild, wild west show. And my brain was having a bit of a struggle linking these two concepts together from when I'd last seen it to what I was seeing that morning. That's what that sticks in my mind. That trip in the Land Rover going through Maseru and just looking at all the places 6 weeks later and just thinking, wow, the last time I'd been here, it didn't quite look like this. Now that it's.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty rare thing to actually come back and see something be calm and a bit restored again. In most modern conflicts, it's the other way around. Myself, I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, and there you usually return to more chaos, not less. And what stuck with me as you were talking wasn't just the transformation of the city, but the way you connected that to the role of the SANDF. Because where I come from, the Swedish Army, we tend to focus on metrics, kill ratios, ammunition usage, how efficient the unit is in combat. But that kind of thinking means actually nothing to anyone until a real war actually comes. What matters most of the time is the connection to the civilian population, the way a defense force interacts with people when things are messy but not completely gone. And honestly, most armies could learn from that, especially the ones that technically could help but usually don't. That's something politicians should take seriously, I think.
Well, our social interaction with our communities. Africans are, by very nature, sociable beings. We like being sociable and we like hanging out and enjoying our lives. So it is not difficult for members of the South African National Defence Force to react in this way. And you've seen it throughout our deployments in the DRC, the Sudan. We are very easily able to communicate and interact with the local population, irrespective of the fact that we're armed and we have an outgoing nature, which is very unique, I think, to South Africans in general. As a people, we shrug off hardships and hard duties and look at the more positive side of life as a people. And it shows in the way we peacekeep and the way we are far more interested in helping, far more interested in doing good than we ever are of achieving kill ratios or doing things like that. Our emphasis is very much on the human side of a conflict versus the pure military side of a conflict. Yes, we understand that sometimes the military and it will require extreme violence to achieve your mission, but as a general rule of thumb, we are very conscious of the social agreement we have between the Defence Force and not only our own citizens, but citizens across the planet, irrespective of where we happen to be operating at that stage.
And I think you're absolutely right, because honestly, you only need to visit South Africa once to feel that. And that's something I have experienced myself. There's a real difference between people who genuinely want to help and those who just go through the motions. And in South Africa, you notice that right away. JP, it's been a real pleasure having you back. Every time we do these episodes, I walk away having learned something new. And I really hope that we will have you back again soon to explore more of these African operations and the history around them. And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We will catch you next week. Bye-bye.
Cool. Thank you, guys. That was fun.